welcome to the, I believe, third in our series of generative AI and teaching for the fall. And as you can see here, we have a link to the slides that Hillary's been sharing in the chat. You can also follow along with the QR code if that's the way you prefer. And now I'm just going to throw it over to Hillary quickly just to introduce herself, and then I'll take it back and introduce myself.
I am Hillary. I'm working with Sally today. We're both members of the Center of Excellence in Learning and Teaching, but I'm part of the Digital Media Projects Office, so we support the implementation of university-provided digital media tools, which we'll talk a bit more about later in the session.
And I'm Sally Goldberg-Powell. I'm an instructional technologist with the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching with the Digital Learning team. So we've been grappling a lot with these questions as part of a subgroup of the Generative AI Working Group in terms of how to manage without having any sort of instructionally supported generative AI tools, how to provide you with some advice, some best practices when thinking about integrating those tools. So today we're going to sort of go through the thinking process a little bit of that. And that's sort of the main focus. But before we get to that, I wanted to ask questions. So just by putting in the chat a number that represents, and maybe there's more than one number that represents how you're feeling right now today. We added the word today because it tends to be something that ebbs and flows and changes from day to day. So you might have felt one way yesterday and another way today. What would you say you're at right now in terms of thinking about generative AI and teaching? Are you diving right in? Are you number 2, feeling the pressure? Or thinking 3, can I just stay here on the side, not diving in? I'm just going to pretend it's not happening, la 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 la. And personally, I will say all 3 of these sound great to me, except maybe the first one. I think I'm a little bit scared of the diving right in. Not to say I'm not playing around with it, but that seems risky. So we're having a lot of 2s. I love John's is an 8. That's great. We have a 1.5 from Julian, lots of 2s. So feeling the pressure, maybe not feeling all that confident about what to do exactly, but feeling that it's there and maybe you should be doing something, but what exactly that might be, not quite sure, which I think is where a lot of us are. So where we're hoping you'll be by the end of today is ready to explore responsibly. So that's kind of our take on all this, is that we're not against the idea of using generative AI as sort of tech folk who work at the university, but that we want to ensure there's some things that you're aware of or that you think about and provide you with some links to existing policies and things that are already in place that sort of apply to the situation that we find ourselves in. And so we're going to go through some of that and some of the processes you might take in order to think about the next steps and hopefully help you get closer to this one, which I would say, I guess this is, I don't know if this is number 4 because it's not a scale, but this is, I think, a happier place to be than any of the other 3. So the agenda today is to talk about, in general, a bit about integrating Gen AI in teaching. There was a bit more about that in the 101 session, and with some of the many hats I'm wearing right now, I will be prepping the video from that session to be shared with all of you next week, hopefully. So anyone who'd like to watch it who wasn't able to attend will be able to watch the video of the 101, which is sort of like a basics of Gen AI, understanding how it might show up in the classroom, how you might want to bring it in, how your students might, and that kind of thing, as well as just some general, definitions that can help. So all that's available. So we'll go over that part briefly. We'll talk about what to do about third-party or external tools, look at some of the relevant policies, laws, and agreements that you might want to keep in mind as instructors and either sharing student data or suggesting students use these tools, ways to mitigate those risks. We'll also talk a little bit about some possible strategies for all of this, and then thinking just about the right approach for you. So it's not really a one-size-fits-all with these things. It's a very much an it depends for almost everything to do with Gen AI. I mean, to do with teaching in general, that's usually the case. So there's, discipline-specific stuff to think about. There's your course specifics to think about, the students that you have, all different kinds of things you might want to think about that we don't imagine that we can take into account all in one workshop, but this just to give you some places to start. So one of the things you might have been grappling with is this idea of how to use Gen AI in your teaching, and you're probably thinking about one of 3 strategies. One being like it's off limits, you're not allowed to use it. no use of Gen AI in any of your assignments, prohibiting it completely, and maybe putting a note about that in your course outline and talking about it in class. The other one is a supervised approach. So that could be either within the classroom, allowing students to use it, or maybe it's just you demonstrating the use of Gen AI in the classroom. And the final way you might be thinking about it, hopefully, is in an informed way. So this is the way we're going to talk about it a lot as well. Is this idea that there's some amount of responsibility on the part of instructors to think about how students are feeling informed about what's allowed in the classroom, what types of precautions to take when using these tools in terms of the types of information you feed into it or what you take from it. And so sometimes if you're going to have students be using it, and giving them a fairly large range of opportunity to just sort of explore, you'll want to at least think about the informed option there. So why would you want to integrate it if it's that complicated? Well, we have to take in the fact that it's actually like something that's becoming more prevalent. It's out there. It is the elephant in the room. And preparing our students for changing work environments is really important, right? We want to make sure that they're aware of these tools, that they can actually maybe even leverage them depending on the industry they're in. For example, if you're in computer science, there's a lot of using of these tools to help with the writing of code or for going through code. So there's a lot of situations where industry specific, they are being leveraged, these tools already, but also just preparing them for the potentiality that would happen. You also want to build their digital literacy through experience. So one of the ways we've built digital literacy for instructors on campus is just to have play times or times when everybody can just try these tools out and see what they can do, because until you apply your own knowledge and experience and expertise to the tool, you can't really see what it's capable of. I can't test it out for to test it for things that are part of your knowledge base because I don't know knowledge, right? So when you use it yourself, you're able to see how it works. So just by experiencing the tools, you're helping to build that digital literacy for your students. You also want to model the appropriate use. So by just saying don't use it, you're not offering an opportunity to see how it might be appropriate and also discouraging misuse. So by saying, okay, here are the ways we can use it, might help to have students navigate best approaches. It can also be a really great way to streamline some of your administrative tasks. So you might find there's some things you can offload to a Gen AI to a degree. Maybe, for example, generating a first draft of a type of recommendation letter you might want to do without having any names in it, for example. And we'll talk more about the type of data you want to put in there later. But you might be able to do that and then, fine tune it from there. Or there can be some, review of stuff or summarizing long articles for you. That kind of thing might be helpful. There are some tools out there that can generate multiple choice questions for you based on text that you might be using in your course. So there's some things administratively that you might want to think about using it for. And there's also the idea of generating more options or variations for assessments. For example, if you use case studies in your teaching, you might be able to say, here's one case study. Can you generate one with these different variables? And you could generate multiple case studies for your students to allow for more variety in the information that's being provided. That can also help with academic integrity. So it can be a double-edged sword. So there's some potential ways of integrating Gen AI. Again, there was a lot more talk about this in the Gen AI 101 workshop, and I'll have a link to that soon in here, as well as it will be shared more broadly. So again, this sort of goes back to the previous slide, but just sort of breaks it down into sort of categories. So it can help with your course delivery. As I mentioned, you can model industry and discipline use. So if it's being used, for example, we've talked to people who work in the travel and tourism industry who teach in TRSM. There's a lot of integration of Gen AI in chatbots or in trip planning that is interesting to look into, new apps and tools being generated so that you can sort of look at those and critique them in class, for example. It can be integrated into the learning that you already have as part of your course. So it could be that as part of coming up with ideas for the essay, you have students actually try out some ideation, some brainstorming using the tools. And again, it can assist with assessment. So some people have played around with the idea of generating feedback based using Gen AI, so putting in assignments and then having it generate feedback feedback or analyzing results of something. So like, for example, putting in a spreadsheet and have it analyze the results for you. This can be really powerful, but it can also cause, maybe it's the one with the most risks. So notice at the bottom of the screen here, I have, while all these are possible uses, it doesn't mean that they don't come with risks. And so it doesn't mean that we're endorsing all these possibilities. We're just saying these are some of the ones that exist. And then there's some decisions to be made on your side about what types of risks you feel confident taking and what kinds of risks would fly into the face of some of the regulations and policies that you have to adhere to. With all of that in mind, what I wanted to do is sort of break down the process of what GenAI basically does. So again, the 101 went through a little bit more what large language models are, for example, but this is just talking about, like, say you open up a tool that allows you to input something and generate something using generative AI, using a large language model. We wanted to break down sort of what's going on in that process for you, so that you can think about those different spots and how questions around privacy, security, risk, those kind of questions might pop up for you, and where you might want to think about how you would integrate it into your coursework and share it with your students how you're doing that. So first thing is the input, right? So the first thing you would do with these tools is input something and say, here's my information that I'd like you to work with. That could be really simple. It could be combined with the prompt. So it could be, give me a list of 5 things to do in Paris. And then really the only input you're giving is 5 things to do in Paris. The prompt is, give me a list, right? Or it could be uploading a file, or it could be copying and pasting a large amount of text and asking for it to summarize. Or it could be an example of a photograph that you then provide a prompt that says, change the background to this, right? So an input can be in multiple different things. It could be just short word or phrase. It could be a whole document. It could be a spreadsheet. It could be a photograph. It could be audio. There are all different kinds of inputs that you could provide to the tool, and then you give it a prompt. And again, they could get combined depending on how complicated or how simple the process is that you're doing. Once you've provided some input and a prompt, the analysis happens. And for the sake of this for this part of the conversation, I'm calling it the Beep Boop Magic process, because we don't want to get into the details of it. There's a lot that happens here, and this could be an entire other workshop in terms of how LLMs work. And there's lots of different nuances to it depending on the large language model you're using. But essentially, it's applying a model to the input and the prompt. So it's, for example, you have, and then it's also using its own data set. So it has its own data set that it's relying on. It has its own programming that's relying on to not only interpret what you have, but the data set was trained on, and it uses all that stuff to go Beep Boop Magic and generate something, predict what would be a good answer to you. And then you get an output. That output can be in multiple different formats. So the most common being a text response. So provide a summary and it provides a short paragraph for you, or maybe a bulleted list. Or it could be an image, audio, video. It could be code. So there's all different types of output. What rarely happens is that the output you get from that process is the end result. Often people say, no, that's not quite right, because these predicting models don't ever know the full context of what we're bringing to this conversation that we're having with these machines. And so we end up going in and reprompting. And just be aware that for most of the cases, when you reprompt, it takes the information you've added in the reprompt as well as everything that came before, combines all that together to create a new analysis and new output. And so that kind of information can be really helpful to know. Again, at the bottom here, I have the link to those slides. I'll just copy that and place it for you in the chat if you'd like to go and look at a bit more of the information about the way these work a little bit more, or some other examples of how they work. You can look at the slides from the GenAI 101 workshop. But what I'm going to do now is, on the second page of this, I have added another line, which is basically some questions you might want to ask yourself at each of these parts of the process. So say you're thinking about having students summarize a couple of articles as a way to try out the tool. and you want to think about the process itself and what you're asking students to do, really. So this is a way of sort of breaking down the process of what's happening and thinking about it at each part of the process. So for example, at the input process, you need to think about what data you're sharing and whether or not it's yours to share. That's whether you're the one putting it in or the students are, right? So if the students are putting it in, they should be asking the same question, and maybe you need to provide some sort of framework for them to understand or know some instruction about that. What if it got into the wrong hands? So even if the policies that have been provided say, oh, don't worry, we're not going to share this with anyone, what sort of what kind of insurances do you have for that, right? What if it did get in the wrong hands? What exactly is that? And thinking through what your responsibility is in terms of protecting the data you are using. With the prompting, again, you've got to think about what exactly the task is that you're asking it to do, and whether or not that's starting to encroach into the roles of certain employees that might be working with you, for example, a TA, right? Whether you're trying to take some of the burden off of them, or if you might be even encroaching on collective agreements, that can actually happen in the use of this stuff. So just sort of like to prompt yourself to think about those things. The analysis part is a really interesting spot because it's really kind of a black hole for most of us. We don't get access to seeing how this is happening. One of the few exceptions to that is that I believe Meta has made it a bit more available to you. You can see what's going on in the background of Llama, which is their LLM, a little bit more, but you'd have to understand all that and you have to have a pretty advanced understanding of how these tools work in order to really understand it. So do you know how your data is being used? Have they made that clear in their policies? Do you know if you're now part of the tool's data set by putting in your stuff? Rarely does what you feed to a large language model and becomes part of their data set becomes something that someone could just query and get exactly the same information back out. But you don't know whose hands it's sitting in because, again, this ends up being a bit of a black box. And then you've got the output. So you've got to think about how you share that output, what that output contains. So there's often biases within the outputs that you're getting because it is based on a large historical amount of documentation that could be ranging from 200 to 300 to 400 years more of data, of which, a lot of more modern thinking would make up such a small percentage, for example. There's also now a lot of checks and balances in these tools to try to avoid giving sort of controversial content back to you. So you might actually find that the opposite's happening, where you're not getting things that are particularly biased. They're just nothing. There's just very little to them, or there's very little value to what they give you because they're not able to grapple with the big questions in the way that human beings can. And finally, with the reprompting, as I said before, you really want to make sure that you're aware of how you are adding more information to the original prompt. So understanding that, say, for example, in the first prompt, you provided a first name, and the second prompt, you provided a last name. Now the tool has both the first and the last name, right? So just thinking of it that way, to know that maybe by adding more context, you might be adding more sensitive data and just being aware of that. So hopefully that helps you sort of break down what's happening in the process and think through those different steps. So you have some questions to ask yourself about the types of tasks that you might want to do, that your students might want to do, and how you're using these tools. And I believe with that, I'm going to hand it over to Hillary, who's going to talk about or provide some guidance around external tools and policies and things like that.
Thanks, Sally. So at TMU, the tools that are provided by the university are vetted. They're checked by security, privacy, accessibility experts. They're made sure that what goes in and comes out is in alignment with the policies of the university and the province. But we don't currently have any Gen AI tools that have been vetted and approved and provided. So anything that you will be choosing to use, it'll be your choice. So instead of it being the lovely synchronous use like the swimmers, it's the boats headed off into the unknown. We don't really know what different people at the university are using. So we're just offering general guidance around how to use it in ways that maybe best align with what the university expects. In the slide, there's a link to just a general doc for how to self-select external tools. It's not AI specific, but it does offer general guidance that can help you get started. But in our slides, and can I have the next slide, Sally? Thank you. We have a long list of laws and policies that are available at the university or apply to the university. As someone who read through all of these this summer, they're not very fun to read, and I'm aware that it takes a lot of time, which most of us don't have, or the desire to read through all the details. So we'll pull out some highlights that relate to generative AI in the next few slides, but if you are interested in learning more, the links to each policy is or a resource is here. But again, I don't know how many other people actually read them all. Yes, Holly. So reading what was available and thinking critically about the AI tools. Yes, Leanne in the chat is pointing out that there are privacy experts, and that is the best way to contact them, the privacy at Toronto MU. Sally and I are not the privacy experts. We encourage you to please contact them if you do actually have specific questions. Our advice is general. But just being mindful when you're choosing these tools, what you can do to mitigate the risk. So just choosing the tool wisely, thinking critically about what the tool is, what it does, what information is available about it, and what commentary also exists. I've found it beneficial to look for reviews from either unbiased or critical sources, because then that can help me figure out where to start doing the more complicated research without having to do all of the work myself. And as Sally said about some of the other tools, looking for transparency, looking for things that make it clear how systems work or what they're pulling from, can help you make decisions that are beneficial to you and your students. And then we were talking about in that little slide with all the different colors about what you might want to input. So thinking critically about what goes in and what your students might be putting in, what information goes in, if it's confidential, and some of the definitions around confidential at the university might surprise you. Things like student names and student numbers, especially if they're paired together. Those are private confidential information. So if you put a student's entire assignment in to a Gen AI tool that has their name and student number on the first page, that could be a privacy issue. So just learning, and again, in the privacy email address and the resources in the last slide can help you figure out what may or may not be okay within the context of your course. And then also the idea of informed consent. So if the work belongs to the student, they should opt into it being added into the system. It shouldn't be uploaded without their consent, either by someone in their group or a grader or an instructor. They should opt into their work being added into these systems, not decided for them. And then a couple other ways within the context of your course that you can mitigate the risk is talking to your students and your colleagues and your administration and telling them how and when you'll be using this tool, why, making it clear that the benefit of it to you or to your students is. And then when you're talking to the students specifically, letting them know how and when you expect them to use the tool and why can help them make good decisions and maybe save some privacy concerns later down the road if they are also thinking through what their use is and why and what they're putting in. And then giving them the choice, letting them opt in or out of using the tool. And if they are opting out of it, what's another option that they can do or explore to have the same learning outcome, but maybe avoid a tool that they are hesitant about that hasn't been approved by the university. And then, of course, we talked a bit about the biases. Testing as much as you can help you identify some problems that the system might have that apply to just your use of it or your students' use of it. So looking to see what the biases are and trying to figure out if it's perpetuating like harmful stereotypes because it's pulling from these old data sets, and trying to maybe avoid those tools and identifying them before you roll them out to your students. And then also, if you are rolling something out to your students, these things change quickly. If you tested it 6 months ago, you saw it at the end of last year and you thought it was a great tool, test it again before you add it into a course this term, and test again right before you use it with your students, because they do change quickly. And I don't ever know what's going on with the tool that I used a couple months ago. they're always a surprise to me at this point. I think that's it for the risk. Okay, I think it's back to you now, Sally.
Back to me. Um, again, these are sort of some thoughts when you're allowing for student use. So before we get to, I just wanted to mention there's a lot of ways of introducing and discussing generative AI that don't require student use. So that might be the comfort zone for you right now. For example, one thing we've been suggesting in some of our consultations is doing demos of how to use things or providing outputs to students for them to critique. So there's ways of doing it so that it's more of an opportunity to see what's possible. You can also read articles about Gen AI. So there's a lot of different things you can do without requiring students to use these tools. But in some cases, it is really beneficial. And I would think too, especially as you get higher up within your program, so it could be a matter of maybe in third and fourth year when you're in smaller classes, that it might be more appropriate than in younger classes or earlier classes. You might find that's the case. There's lots of different ways to think about it, and it might be something that's worth thinking about at a program level. Anyway, with all that said, if you are having students using the tools, this will go through some of the other mitigating things again, just to re-emphasize them, but the idea of really being clear about how and when you'll use it in your class. Not only by providing that do you let students know what to expect, because the truth is most students are feeling like at number 2 or 3 like we are, and aren't really feeling like super excited about this. There are some that are really eager to learn, and some turn to it in a moment of desperation, and others are just not quite sure what to make of it yet and are actually really worried about their own future and how this might impact their career choices. So with all that in mind, putting their minds at ease as well by providing that information about how and when to use it is really, it can really help set them raise their comfort level. Also telling them what to avoid or opt out options. So provide them with that information about how to use these responsibly. Maybe it's just a short page that you have on your D2L, a shell where you just sort of lay out, like, just before you go and put things in, remember these few key important things. Avoid putting in people's full names into these tools if you're not confident about where the data is going. No, you don't have to use these tools if you aren't comfortable, and here are your other, please reach out to me. Like, all that kind of information would be valuable to share with students when you are planning on incorporating it into the teaching. Make sure that whatever tools you're using are easily accessible to all students, or that you've come up with a plan that, for example, it works on group work, so that way students within the group can choose who's going to be the one using the tool, and that can help a little bit. But basically, don't expect students to have to pay for a tool. Look at what the free tools can offer you, and if there's something that will work for you in that way. Be sure that any information you provide to them you refer to regularly. So it's not just like a footnote in your course outline, but because this stuff is new in particular, it would be a good idea to refer to it multiple times. So anytime you're talking about the assignment, to remind them about the information and about their options available to them. And another thing you can do, a lot of people have been looking into this, is like co-creating the rules around using Gen AI. So you can, work with your students, maybe provide a collaborative document where you all work on, or just have a discussion and come up with a document based on the discussion about how they feel it would be most appropriate to use the tools. I recently attended a conference where this was something that an instructor had decided to do, and she actually found the second term, as students became more and more aware of these tools, they actually were more restrictive with each other about how they wanted to use it. They got more scared. So you might find that your fears are not even close to what the fears that your students have by having it as an open conversation. Some other things that you want to make sure you provide some instructions for is if you have them trying out some prompting, you might want to give them some tips for prompting. There's lots of great sites out there. There's too much information about generative AI out there right now. It's really hard to weed through, but there's a lot of great things about tips for prompting out there that you can refer to, try out yourself before you provide to your students, and then just provide them with some information. The other big important thing is the idea of proper citations. We now have a LibGuide at the library that goes through Gen AI in research and things, and I believe it also links to some citation examples that have been started to be created. So if students are going to use information that they generated with Gen AI within their assignments, you may want them to provide citations. or some sort of reflection to allow you to know when and where they're using it. Maybe how to read privacy policies. These aren't easy things to do, like certain things to flag. So if you look at that chart we provided earlier with all those different options, or all those different questions you can ask, you can provide them with some of those questions and say, look at the privacy policy. Do they answer these types of questions for you? If you have them looking at tools and investigating them themselves. And also just if they're using them, just to let them know they can look at the privacy policy before they choose to use it and what their opt-out options are. And again, how to avoid inputting sensitive data, as I mentioned before. And finally, just keeping open those methods of communication and feedback with students. We're all experimenting with this. Would be great to say we're through the experimentation process, but we're not, because they're evolving tools. There just hasn't been the time. We've been grappling with them on the fly because they're out there. So we're still in experimentation phase. And when you think about that, it's a really great idea to involve your students in the conversation from the beginning and let them know that's where you are at too. We're all there. There's no way to be a full-on expert on these things because they're moving too fast. So keeping the lines of communication open is really important. So finding a way to let students know how they can reach out for ongoing support if they require it. We have I'll see if I can find the link while we have our Q&A to our Google Form library. And one of the things we have in there is a Q&A Google Form for assignments where basically students can put in a question. They have view-only access to a spreadsheet where the questions pop up automatically and you can provide responses. So that way it's a public-facing way of sharing what the responses have been to the questions that have been asked, and it's all anonymous. So that's one possible way. Or maybe there's a discussion space on your D2L Brightspace shell, or a time during class when you put questions, maybe even peer feedback sessions. So if you're doing some amount of prompting and getting results, that maybe you share it with each other and talk about what you're seeing, because every time you put in a prompt, you might get something different back. So even if all the students are putting in the same prompt, they'll be getting different responses in some small way here and there, especially depending on the tool. So it might be nice for them to compare and contrast what the results are. A reflection component in assessments. Again, when I was in sessions last week or 2 weeks ago now at the Digital Pedagogy Institute, this came up over and over again, that almost anyone I heard speak about integrating Gen AI into their classwork was ensuring there was a reflection component to that work. So that was their way of knowing how it was used, giving students a space to express what their experience was with the tool. But even more than that, I think for those instructors, it's peace of mind to know that their students are being transparent about their Gen AI use. And that's a real benefit from actually having students use it, is that you're able to see and understand how they're using it and be able to sort of reflect on that and respond to that in future courses or future offerings of a course. And one way to do that is also in an annotated bibliography style formative assessments. So you could actually have a step prior to doing the assignment where you have them do the Gen AI work, share what they found, say how they might use it in their assignment, and that way you can provide feedback or some sort of intervention before they actually apply it to something. And then the idea of having some sort of short student survey about what they thought about doing it, or a post-mortem discussion, so you can learn from the experience as well in a more intentional way. And that's all we had to share with you. It's a lot. I know we rambled through it, but part of the reason we did that is because we want to ensure we had time at the end to talk about more specific questions, if any have popped up for you. You may also just want to sort of digest this stuff. I know in conversations prior to having this workshop, we look at the idea of sharing some specific tools with everyone, but the truth is, the tools change all the time. The tools that work for one person in this workshop probably might not work for another. I play around with some myself. I'm happy to sort of talk about them, but always with a grain of salt, because things change quickly. They haven't been fully vetted for privacy and security. So I always know that there's those things to consider and to communicate to my students when we are using them in class. I teach first-year journalism courses, and so the use of it is very minimal, but we do talk about it because it's out there. And so happy to answer any questions about that, and look forward to your questions as well. I'm just pointing out that on the screen right now is the fact that there are still 4 more in the series coming, from talking about learning outcomes, academic integrity, accessibility, and written assignment. So I hope that you're able to join one of those sessions or more. And yeah, I'm going to stop the recording and open it up to any questions.